Rancher lived alone for years, until 10 Apaches changed his life. Wild West stories. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Out west, a man buried himself in silence for 10 long years. Then, one stormy night, a knock came at his door. Not an enemy, but 10 women carrying both sorrow and hope. That night, he had to choose: keep dying in solitude or open the door and begin to live again. He lived like a shadow, but the emptiness inside him was wider than the prairie. Morning came slow out on the high plains, the way an old horse rises from its knees. Dust from the night settled in a thin skin across the yard, clinging to boots, clinging to the brittle weeds along the fence line. Elias Ward swung open the barn door, the hinge giving a tired groan that folded neatly into the chill of dawn. He scooped feed from a sack, the grain warm in his palm, and the bay gelding lowered its head, soft eyes clouded with years. The man's rough hand stroked the bridge of its nose, an act so practiced it felt less like work than prayer. His cabin sat on a rise, weathered timbers gray with age, looking out across a sweep of dry grass that ran until the land stacked itself into low, dark hills. Every morning he brewed his coffee the same way, grounds in a blackened pot, boiled hard, then left to settle on the coals. He measured time, not with clocks, but with the creak of the windmill, with the crawl of sunlight over the cracks in the porch step. The first swallow was always bitter. He took it without sugar. The bitterness kept him awake, and somehow honest. There were 2 chairs in the cabin. One he pulled close to the window, where he could watch the pasture. The other sat tucked in a corner, with a coat draped over it. Dust lay on that chair, not thick, but even. He left it alone. So too the cedar chest under his bed, where things that didn't belong to the present lay folded away. A ribbon faded pale, a knife with a bone handle, photographs worn until the faces blurred, stones at the bottom of a dry creek. You didn't stir them unless you wanted the water muddied. Elias lived by habit. His eyes counted fence posts. His hands knew every nail in the barn. His ears told one coyote's pad from another. He knew which stretch of ground would sink after a rain, where the wild daisies bloomed late, how the wind shifted at sundown. All these small facts built a wall around his days, and inside that wall was silence, the silence of a man finished with the world. At noon, the sun poured white over the yard. He tugged his hat brim low and hauled water from the well, slow and steady. The rope groaned, the bucket came up shining. One measure for himself, one for the horse, the rest spilled into a trough where the chickens scrambled. On the porch rail, a bridle hung, stitching frayed. He set to it with needle and twine, fingers stiff but steady, mending leather the way some men mend memories. Tight stitches, nothing fancy, just enough to keep it from tearing further. By evening, the wind changed smell. Out here, you learned to read what no one taught. The faint scorch of grass fire, the iron of lightning before it struck, the damp promise of rain still 2 ridges away. He sat on the step, boots crossed, watching the sun break into strands of gold through the dust. Sparrows dropped into the yard, pecking at stray grain. He broke a crust of bread, tossed it. One bold bird hopped onto the rail, head cocked, eyes shining. He offered another crumb from his boot. The bird snatched it and flew. That was enough. When night settled, he built a fire in the stove. The iron door groaned, coals snapping like distant hail. He hung a pot, not caring if it boiled. Some nights, he oiled the saddle, the smell of tallow mixing with wood smoke. Some nights, he only sat, back to the chair, watching smoke curl through a crack in the roof. Smoke had its own way out, same as time. He never hurried either. In a place like this, a man could become his own shadow. Elias knew it, and he chose it. To be a decent shadow was better than being nothing. He made no noise, caused no trouble, owed no debt. Days passed like well water, cool, clear, without taste. Some might call it empty, but emptiness was peace, and peace had cost him more than he cared to name. When the long day closed, he turned his cup over on the table against the dust, damped the fire, stepped into the yard once more. Above him, the stars stretched wide, cold and close enough to touch. He stood still, boots planted on ground cooling underfoot, making no wish, asking no favor. Then he went back in, slid the heavy bar across the door. The thud of iron on wood was final, neat, enough. Inside, every object knew its place. Elias lay down, pulled the blanket to his chest, turned the pillow to its cool side. The smell of wood smoke, dry hide, and old pine boards carried him under. Tomorrow would be the same as today, if he chose it to be. Out here, the west was wide enough to swallow any sound, and in the hollow of one man's chest, the silence could be just as wide. Elias had learned to live with that silence, the way a rider learns to move with his horse. No force, no fight, just balance. And within that steady rhythm, he carried a single wish he never spoke: to finish his days in quiet, without lifting another stone from the river bottom of his heart. Out here, wishes didn't need words. They settled into the wind, into the grind of hinges, into the bitterness of coffee, into the stitches on a worn strap, signs that a man was still holding his world together, thread by thread. The land breathed in slow rhythm, until something came to break it apart. The land around Elias's place was plain to a stranger's eye, but to him it was a book he'd read too many times to count. The cabin, built with his own hands, leaned into the wind on a knoll above the flats. The boards had bleached to the color of bone, and every nail head showed its rust, yet the frame still held. Out beyond, the pasture sloped toward a shallow draw where sage and greasewood clung to poor soil. When the wind moved, the brush shimmered silver, like the hide of some great animal breathing in its sleep. Mornings began with chores. He carried water in 2 battered pails. The handles wrapped in leather where the metal had bitten into his palms long ago. Chickens fussed at his boots, waiting for the scatter of grain. A barn cat slipped between shadows, a silent streak of gray, her kittens tumbling behind. Elias never called to them, never named them. They simply lived near him, as he lived near them, each keeping a respectful distance. By midday, the heat thickened. The well's rope creaked with each pull, its sound marking the slow passage of hours. He would pause, hat brim low, to watch a hawk circle high over the flats. The bird's cry hung sharp against the vast silence, a sound that seemed to cut through more than air. Then it would vanish, leaving only the steady hum of locusts and the distant rasp of the windmill. Inside the cabin, his life was ordered, though no one else might see the order. A tin plate, scrubbed thin from years of use. A rifle over the mantel, polished though rarely touched. Shelves lined with jars of beans and coffee, stacked in the same place season after season. He lived careful, not from fear, but from the habit of a man who had no one else to remember for him. If he didn't keep track, no one would. Sometimes, near sundown, he walked the fence line. His boots sank into powder-dry soil, the boards creaking under his hand as he leaned to test their give. In one corner a length of wire sagged, and he made a note in his head to fix it come morning. He worked not for profit, not for show, but to keep the place standing. A man could lose himself if he let the small things go. The land had its own rhythm, and Elias matched it. Sun rose, he worked. Sun set, he rested. Rain came, he mended. Drought stayed, he endured. There were no visitors, no neighbors dropping by, no letters carried in by riders from town. The last tracks that had led to his door had long since blown over. The trail to his ranch was little more than a scar in the earth, nearly erased. And so the days slid one into another, each much like the last. He didn't mark them on a calendar. He carried them in his body instead. The stiffness of his shoulders, the callus on his palms, the lines deepening around his eyes. He'd lived long enough out here to know that time doesn't need counting. It leaves its proof without being asked. Now and then, when dusk spread across the flats, he'd stand by the porch rail and watch the light drain from the sky. Shadows pooled in the draws, coyotes yipped far off, and the first stars pierced through. He never spoke into that dark. He let it speak to him. The land said the same thing it had always said: nothing lasts but the wind. and Elias nodded, as though agreeing with an old companion. The West held many kinds of silence. There was the silence of a canyon at noon, heavy and echoing. The silence of snow burying a trail. The silence of a man alone too long, where even memory grows quiet. That last was the silence Elias knew best, and though it might have broken another man, he wore it like a coat. He rose with it, ate with it, laid down to sleep with it, and each day it carried him a little farther along the narrow trail he called a life. The storm crashed down, and a sudden knock splintered the silence. The day had gone down quiet, nothing more than a pale line of sun sinking behind the low hills. Elias had stacked kindling in the stove, banked it to a soft glow, and sat with his tools spread on the table. A length of worn leather lay across his lap. He threaded a needle, mended the strap, slow, knot by knot, the way a man tends to his own thoughts. By nightfall, the air thickened. The smell came first, wet dust and iron, the sharp taste of rain still miles away. Then the wind rose, tugging at the shutters, rattling the eaves. Elias knew the signs. Out here you learn to read storms like other men read books. He set his cup aside, checked the latch on the barn, made certain the gelding had hay enough, then shut himself inside. The storm broke with a sound like musket fire. Rain hammered the roof, ran in sheets down the window glass, and slapped the porch boards in a steady rhythm. Lightning lit the room white for a heartbeat, then left it darker than before. Elias sat in his chair, the leather strap still in hand, letting the noise wash over him. Storms were old companions. They came and went. Then knocking. At first, he thought it was the wind. The storm could make a man hear things. But it came again, sharper, insistent, a hollow thud on the heavy oak door. Not the friendly tap of a neighbor. He had none. Not the aimless pounding of the wind. This was a human hand, desperate, asking to be heard over the fury outside. Elias's hand stilled on the leather. For a moment the years fell away, and the sound carried him back to a night long ago, when he'd opened his door and the world had come apart before sunrise. He drew in a breath, slow and measured, eyes fixed on the door as though it might move again on its own. Another knock, louder this time. Rainwater hissed against the chimney. Thunder rolled close enough to shake the floorboards. Whoever was out there hadn't turned back. He rose, joint stiff, and crossed the room without hurry. His boots made soft sounds against the planks. At the door he paused, laid one palm flat against the wood. The grain was cool, damp at the edges. Behind it, he thought he caught something. Muffled voices, the cadence of speech carried on the wind. Not English, a tongue he had not heard in many years. Elias closed his eyes. The storm pressed hard against the cabin walls as if it meant to force its way inside. But it was not the weather that set his chest tight. It was that sound, knuckles on oak, voices thin and urgent, that tugged at a place he had tried to bury. He let his hand fall from the door and stood still, the rain pounding overhead, the storm swelling all around. The leather strap he'd left on the table waited, needle still looped through. The fire in the stove hissed and popped. The house seemed to hold its breath with him. Out beyond the door, someone knocked a third time. On the porch stood 10 figures, trembling in the rain like ghosts. The third knock lingered in his bones. Elias drew the bar tighter against the frame, though it was already firm, and stood in the middle of the room, listening. The storm raged against the roof, but under it he caught a rhythm not born of wind or wood. The scrape of shoes, a low murmur, human presence holding fast against the weather. At last he moved to the window, lifted one corner of the shutter with careful fingers. Rain ran in silver streams down the glass. Through it he saw shadows clinging to the porch, huddled close, a cluster of shapes beaten thin by the storm. Lightning bared them for a breath. Women, their dresses clung to them heavy with water, hair plastered to their faces, arms wrapped around one another. Not one or two, but many, 10, perhaps more. One figure at the front cradled something small and trembling against her chest. Even from the dim flash, Elias saw the pale curve of a child's cheek, lips pressed silent in the cold. Another, older, stood straight despite the rain, her hair streaked with silver. her eyes steady even as water streamed down her face. They were not begging with outstretched hands. They were simply there, waiting, like trees in a storm, too strong to resist. He let the shutter fall shut, the room returning to darkness. His heart beat heavy in his ribs, not with fear exactly, but with something that carried its weight. Memories rose, faces in lamplight, voices at a doorway, choices that had cost him dearly. He pressed the heel of his hand to his brow and breathed deep. The storm bellowed. Water leaked under the sill, spreading across the floor in slow lines. He did not move to wipe it. He stood rooted, caught between the safety of silence and the pull of those figures outside. His gaze went to the iron bar across the door. For years it had been his sentinel, keeping the world at bay. Tonight, it felt more like a question. A gust slammed the wall, and the knock came again, weaker, but no less certain. The baby stirred, a muffled cry seeping through the heavy wood. Elias's chest tightened. He turned away from the door, walked the length of the room once, twice, his boots leaving dark marks where the rain had blown in. Each step carried the weight of his own years, solitude chosen, peace clung to, grief left untended. He stopped before the door once more, his hand brushing the bar as though by accident. The oak was damp to the touch. On the other side, a cluster of lives leaned into his silence. The fire cracked in the stove, a small, ordinary sound. But in that moment, it felt like the last noise of a life lived alone. Elias closed his eyes. The storm kept hammering. The voices faded, rose again. And still, he had not lifted the bar. The eyes of a stranger reflected the same loss he carried within. For a long while, Elias stood without moving, the storm beating its wild hands against the walls. His fingers lingered on the iron bar, cool and certain, while his mind drifted to places he had sworn never to revisit. He thought he'd buried those memories deep, yet tonight they rose, called back by the voices outside. Another crack of lightning tore the sky, and in that flash, through the seam between shutter and frame, he saw her. The older woman standing just beyond the others. She was straight-backed, though the storm bent everything else. Rainwater cut lines across her face, silver hair clung to her cheeks, yet her eyes held steady. Eyes that did not plead, did not demand. They only met the night with a worn, unflinching patience. Elias felt something shift in him. In those eyes, he saw his own reflection, the look of someone who had buried too much to speak of it, who had lived on because there was nothing else left to do. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself every morning for years. The silence of loss recognizes itself. He turned from the door, walking back into the room, but her gaze lingered inside him. He tried to busy his hands with the leather strap he'd abandoned, tried to thread the needle again, but his fingers fumbled. The storm's roar filled the cabin, loud yet empty, and her quiet eyes seemed louder still. By the window he paused, letting the shutter slip open just enough to see them again. The women clung together, shoulders touching, shawls pressed tight against the wind. One crouched low, shielding a girl no more than 16. Another pressed a cloth against a wound at her arm. The older woman remained at the front, unmoving, her face turned toward his door, as though she could see him standing there in the dark. He closed the shutter, leaned his forehead against the cold wood. For years he had chosen solitude as his fortress, but now that fortress felt less like shelter and more like a cell. The storm outside, the water seeping in, the weight in his chest, all of it pressed the same truth upon him. A man cannot shut out his own reflection forever. The fire whispered behind him. The cabin smelled of wet wood and old leather. Elias lifted his head, eyes on the door once more. The bar was still there, firm in its brackets. Beyond it, 10 soaked figures held their ground in the storm, one pair of eyes waiting with a patience that was also a challenge. He did not move the bar, not yet, but for the first time in many years he felt the urge to. The frail cry of a child turned the key on a door locked for 10 years. The storm raged harder, the kind of downpour that could strip topsoil from the earth and turn dry gullies into rivers overnight. Elias sat in the half-dark, staring at the door as if it were more than oak and iron, something closer to a verdict. His hand flexed and unflexed against his knee. He thought of all the nights he'd leaned that same bar into place, shutting out coyotes, drifters, and memories alike. Then it came, a sound small enough to pierce through thunder, a cry, thin, raw, not of storm or wind, but of a child. It was muffled, wrapped in rain and wood, yet it slipped past every wall Elias had built around himself. The sound found the hollow inside him, where no silence had ever fit right. It was a weak cry, a breath straining against the cold. He felt it in his ribs, as if the child had been laid against his own chest. Elias rose, slow as a man twice his age, and stood by the door. The storm beat on, relentless, but that one sound filled the room until he heard nothing else. He pressed his palm flat against the wood. It was damp, trembling faintly with each knock of rain. On the other side, a life no bigger than his forearm clung to the world by a thread. He thought of another night, another cry, his own daughter, feverish, curling into her mother's arms. He remembered dipping cloths in cool water, laying them across a tiny brow. He remembered the hush that fell when the fever broke, and the heavier hush that followed when breath did not return. Those echoes had never left him. Tonight they came rushing back, sharp as glass. His throat tightened. The cry came again, weaker, and it was enough. Elias set both hands to the bar. For a moment he hesitated, his body resisting out of habit, years of solitude tightening against the choice. The iron was heavy with rust and memory, yet he lifted it free, slow, steady. The sound of metal leaving wood was louder than the storm itself. He pulled the door inward. Wind shoved at him, rain slashing his face, lantern light spilling into the dark. On the porch, the women huddled close, their dresses plastered to their bodies, hair dripping, eyes hollow from too many miles. At the center, a young woman held the baby, its lips pale, its tiny hands twitching in the cold. Elias did not speak. He simply stepped back, leaving the doorway open, a path from storm to firelight. The women moved with hesitation at first, then with urgency, slipping past him into the warmth. The older one, she of the silver hair, paused as she crossed, meeting his eyes. No words passed between them, but something in her look told him what he already knew. The key that turned the lock tonight was not courage, not pity, but the fragile cry of a child, reminding him he was still human. The door swung shut behind them, shutting out the storm. But the storm inside Elias had only begun. Through a night of shelter, fire, and silence warmed weary souls. The cabin filled quick with the scent of wet wool, mud, and blood. 10 women, their shawls dripping, their dresses torn, moved quietly into the small room. They brought the storm with them, the hiss of soaked fabric, the rasp of heavy breathing. But soon, even that sound sank into the low hum of fire. Elias pushed the bar back into place, not to shut them in, but to give the night some boundary. They spread themselves out in the narrow space without a word. One eased the baby toward the fire, unwrapping the damp cloth that clung to its skin. Another knelt beside a girl no older than 16, binding her arm with a strip torn from her own hem. The older woman, silver streaks darkened by rain, stood for a while near the door, water dripping from her hair, before at last lowering herself onto the bare floorboards. Elias busied himself with what he could. He set a kettle on the stove, filled tin cups with warm water, dragged a blanket from his bed to lay across shoulders bent from exhaustion. He made no speech, offered no comfort beyond the small gestures a man could make without breaking the silence. His hands did the talking, steady, deliberate, like mending a fence against the wind. The women accepted what was given with nods, with the slow blink of eyes heavy from travel. None tried to speak English beyond a word or two. Their quiet was not the quiet of strangers unwilling to share, but the quiet of those who had carried too much already. Elias understood that kind of silence. It was the same language he spoke. The fire burned low, throwing shadows across the walls. The sound of rain softened, turning from a drumbeat to a steady whisper. In that half-dark, the room seemed smaller, almost crowded, but not with unease. For the first time in years, Elias felt the weight of other breathing beside his own, and it startled him less than he had imagined. He sat in his chair, hands folded on his knees, watching the fire catch the glint of water on their skin, the shine of dark eyes reflecting the flames. Now and then the baby stirred, a thin whimper muffled quickly by the young woman's touch. Each time Elias looked away, not from hardness, but because the sound drew too close to a wound he still carried. Hours passed. The storm outside broke itself against the hills, rolling on toward some other valley. Inside, the stillness grew thick, layered with the faint crackle of embers and the slow rhythm of weary bodies leaning into rest. Elias did not sleep. He kept his post as if the cabin were under siege, though the only enemy was time itself. He thought of Sarah, her hand smoothing the same blanket he had just laid across a stranger's shoulders, her voice scolding him for mistrusting those in need. He thought of his daughter, the way her breath had fluttered like a candle's flame. And he thought of how this night, long and heavy as it was, carried a different weight, not the weight of loss, but of presence. When the fire burned to coals, Elias rose and added wood, careful not to wake those who had sunk into exhausted sleep. The light brightened for a moment, throwing their faces into clear relief, lined with weariness, marked by scars, yet softened by slumber. Survivors, every one of them. He settled back into his chair, eyes heavy, yet his body refused to yield. Outside, the storm weakened. Inside, another kind of storm swirled quietly in his chest. He had opened his door once more to the world, and there would be no closing it the same way again. Dawn took them away, leaving only a leather token and a new kind of quiet. The storm bled itself dry before morning. By the time the first light touched the hills, the land lay hushed beneath a skin of mist. Puddles mirrored the sky, fences dripped with rain, and the air smelled washed clean. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to gray coals, their faint glow the only witness to the long night. Elias rose stiffly from his chair. He had not slept, though his eyes were heavy and his shoulders sore. The women were already moving with quiet purpose. One fed the baby from a scrap of bread softened in water. Another bound the last of their wounds with strips of cloth taken from their skirts. They spoke softly among themselves, words Elias could not follow, yet the sound of them filled the cabin like a low chant, gentle, steady, alive. He fetched water from the well, the bucket squealing against the rope, and poured it into tin cups. They drank without ceremony, nodding once in thanks. Elias answered with a tilt of his head. Words felt unnecessary. The night had spoken for them all. As the sun broke free, gold spread across the flats, catching on each droplet that clung to the brush. The storm had left behind a world that glistened, as though newly forged. Elias stood at the door, watching the women gather their few belongings. Their dresses clung still damp, their hair tangled, yet in the light they looked less like refugees and more like figures carved out of the land itself, rooted, enduring, unyielding. They stepped onto the porch one by one. The young girl with the baby pressed it close, tucking the child's face beneath her chin. The others followed, silent, their boots sinking into the soft earth. The older woman, silver hair shining in the sun, was the last to linger. She turned back once, eyes meeting Elias's with the same steady gaze she had held through the storm. No plea, no farewell, only recognition. From her palm, she offered him a strip of leather, worn smooth, etched faintly with patterns of her people. She placed it in his hand without a word, then turned to follow the others. The leather was warm from her grasp, its lines pressed deep by use. Elias closed his fingers around it, feeling more weight in that small piece than in any tool or weapon he had ever held. He stood on the porch as they walked away, their shapes shrinking against the expanse of open country. The sun caught them in flashes, on a shawl, on the swing of a braid, on the pale curve of the baby's cheek. Then they were gone, swallowed by distance, leaving behind only the sound of wet grass bending under their steps. The cabin was empty again when Elias returned inside. The silence met him at the threshold, familiar yet changed. It no longer pressed heavy, no longer echoed. It was a softer thing, touched by the memory of breathing, of whispered words, of a child's cry that had cut through even the fiercest storm. He set the leather strip on the table. The fire was dead, but in its place lay a different warmth, faint but certain, like an ember hidden deep in ash. Elias sat for a long time, hands resting open on his knees, the strip of leather lying between them. The storm had passed, the house was still, but something inside him had shifted. Quiet, small, irreversible. In a quiet smile he knew, living again sometimes begins with an open door. Morning stretched slow across the flats, sunlight spilling wider with each minute, burning the mist away. Elias sat by the window, the strip of leather lying in his palm. Its surface carried the wear of many hands before his, the faint grooves of symbols he could not read. Yet he felt them all the same. They spoke without words, of endurance, of loss, of kinship that survives in silence. The cabin, emptied of voices, seemed larger than it had the day before. The chairs sat where they always had, the stove gray with ash, the saddle waiting on its peg. Nothing had moved, yet everything felt altered. He had lived so long believing quiet was the same as peace. Now he knew better. Quiet could carry weight. It could remind a man of what he'd shut out. He rose, stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under his boots, damp still from the storm. From there, he could see the long trail their footprints had cut through the wet grass, already fading under the sun. Far off, the land was empty again, the kind of empty that went on forever. But Elias no longer saw it as barren. Somewhere out there, 10 women and a child walked on, and he was bound to them by a single night and a strip of leather in his hand. He turned the token between his fingers, the light catching the etched lines. A man could carry many burdens in his life, some heavy as stone, some light as breath. This piece of leather felt like both. He slipped it into his shirt pocket, close to his chest, not for safekeeping, but as a reminder that he was not as alone as he had once believed. The gelding whickered from the barn. Elias walked over, ran a hand along the animal's neck, felt the warmth and steadiness beneath the hide. The horse nosed at his pocket, as if sensing something new there. Elias chuckled softly. An unfamiliar sound, thin and low, but real. When he returned to the porch, he did not sit right away. He stood with his face turned to the sun, eyes narrowed against the brightness. A breeze lifted across the yard, carrying the smell of damp sage, of earth rinsed clean. For the first time in many years, Elias let his shoulders loosen. He breathed deep, and the breath did not feel like a burden. Finally, he settled into his chair, the one by the window, and leaned back. The land stretched wide before him, endless as ever. Yet the emptiness no longer pressed hard against his chest. It held space, room enough for memory, for grief, and now for a small ember of hope. A smile came, quiet and unpracticed, creasing his face in lines long unused. It wasn't for anyone to see. It was his alone, a sign that the man who thought himself finished had discovered a piece of life still waiting. The west went on, vast and indifferent, but Elias Ward, sitting with the sun on his face and a strip of leather near his heart, felt the faint stir of something he hadn't known in years. Not joy, not yet, but the first step toward it. And sometimes, in a land this hard, that was enough. Out here, storms come and go, leaving the land scrubbed clean but scarred. A man is no different. Elias Ward had lived as if his heart were a boarded-up cabin. But one night of rain, a child's cry, and the quiet courage of strangers reminded him that solitude is not the same as peace. Sometimes healing doesn't roar in like thunder. It slips in softly, like dawn breaking over wet grass. And that's the way of the West. It teaches us that no one walks forever alone, not if we're willing to open the door when the knock comes. If this story touched a place in you, I'd like to hear it. Not for numbers, not for noise, but because sharing our scars and our silences is how we remind each other we're still here, still human.